You can keep the tray, but leave your dignity at the door if you expect to survive this shift. The words floated through the service hallway just before the laughter followed, soft enough to sound harmless, sharp enough to leave a mark. Crystal glasses chimed somewhere beyond the double doors. Jazz drifted through the marble lobby of the Grand Kensington Hotel, where executives toasted billion-dollar mergers beneath chandeliers that glittered like captured stars. Hidden behind polished smiles and tailored suits, another kind of performance unfolded where no guest ever looked. Naomi Brooks tightened her grip around the silver breakfast service tray and pretended she hadn't heard a thing. She had learned years ago that silence often protected a paycheck better than pride ever could. At 26, she had exactly one shift left before rent was due, one paycheck standing between her younger sister and another eviction notice taped to their apartment door. Every dollar mattered. Every mistake mattered even more. So when the restaurant floor manager called her name with a smile that never reached her eyes, Naomi already knew something was wrong. Private executive suite, the manager said casually. Mr. Kong requested breakfast service. Several servers exchanged quick glances before looking away. One covered a laugh with the back of her hand. Another whispered something Naomi couldn't quite hear, followed by the unmistakable sound of a diamond ring tapping rhythmically against the marble wall. Tap, 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 like someone counting down to humiliation. Everyone inside the hotel knew the stories about Kong Teo, the blind heir to the Kong global hospitality empire. The billionaire CEO, chosen to inherit an international corporation worth billions. The man employees described as impossible to please, ruthless with incompetence, and colder than the penthouse windows overlooking downtown Chicago. Some claimed he could identify people by the sound of their breathing. Others swore he'd dismissed senior executives without ever raising his voice. Whether the stories were true hardly mattered anymore. Fear had a way of becoming its own truth. Try not to get fired before lunch, another waitress muttered as Naomi reached the private elevator. More laughter followed. None of them knew this assignment had never been about breakfast. It was about entertainment. Someone had carefully arranged for the quiet black waitress to become the morning's joke. Naomi stepped into the elevator alone, watching the gold numbers climb higher with each silent second. She adjusted the white cuffs of her pressed uniform and exhaled slowly. Her mother had once told her that dignity was the only thing poverty could never steal unless you surrendered it first. Naomi carried those words the same way she carried every tray, with steady hands even when everything inside her trembled. The elevator doors opened onto the executive floor where silence replaced music. Thick carpet swallowed every footstep. Floor-to-ceiling windows flooded the hallway with soft morning sunlight. At the very end stood the largest private suite in the hotel. She stopped outside the door, suddenly aware that someone behind her had quietly stepped off another elevator. A faint chuckle echoed before disappearing. Then came the tapping again. Tap, 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 waiting, listening, hoping she would fall apart. Naomi raised her hand and knocked twice. Come in. A calm male voice answered immediately. She pushed the door open, letting it close softly behind her. Before she could introduce herself, before the tray even touched the dining table, the man facing the skyline spoke without turning around. 3 people laughed before you knocked, he said evenly. One of them kept tapping a ring against the wall because she couldn't wait to hear you fail. And you've been standing exactly 3 feet from my door for the last 12 seconds, deciding whether you should trust anything you've been told about me. So tell me. He paused just long enough for her heartbeat to become the loudest sound in the room. Are you going to lie to me too? Naomi felt every muscle in her body tighten, but she did not look away. There would have been no point. The man standing beside the floor-to-ceiling windows could not see her face, yet somehow she had the unmistakable feeling that he already understood every emotion passing through it. She swallowed carefully before answering. No, sir, she said softly. I am not going to lie. A quiet silence settled across the suite. It was not uncomfortable. It felt deliberate, almost like a conversation happening before either of them spoke another word. Then tell me, Kong Teo said. What exactly did they tell you about me? Naomi glanced toward the untouched breakfast tray resting in her hands. She could still leave pieces of the truth hidden behind polite words. Every employee in the hotel knew how to survive difficult guests. Smile. Apologize. Never volunteer information. Finish the assignment. Keep your job. But something about his calm voice made rehearsed answers feel strangely dishonest. They said you would probably ignore me, she admitted, or dismiss me before I finished serving breakfast. They said I should avoid speaking unless you asked me a direct question because you do not like people wasting your time. She hesitated for only a heartbeat. Someone also said you had fired people for making too much noise while pouring coffee. The corner of his mouth lifted ever so slightly. It was not amusement exactly. It looked more like recognition. Interesting, he said quietly. Anything else? Naomi remembered the laughter outside the elevator, the tapping ring, the knowing smiles. They expected me to fail, she answered honestly. I think that was the real reason they sent me here. Another pause followed. Outside, morning sunlight reflected across the Chicago skyline, filling the suite with warm gold while neither of them moved. Finally, Teo let out a slow breath. They chose the wrong room. Naomi blinked. Sir. Because they expected fear, he replied. Instead, they sent someone who answered my question. He slowly turned toward her. His eyes remained unfocused, fixed somewhere just beyond her shoulder, but his expression carried none of the arrogance she had imagined. The rumors had painted a man made of ice. The person standing before her looked more like someone who had simply grown tired of disappointment. Tell me your name. Naomi Brooks. He repeated it carefully, each syllable deliberate. Naomi. Not Miss Brooks. Not waitress. Not young lady. Simply Naomi. Somehow hearing her own name spoken with that much attention unsettled her more than everything else that morning. Most guests never bothered reading the name stitched neatly above her pocket. Most people just call me Nay, she offered awkwardly. I am not most people, he answered without hesitation. Something inside her relaxed before she even realized it had been tense. He walked toward the dining table with slow confidence, never reaching for furniture, never hesitating before each step. His movements were too practiced to be accidental. Please describe breakfast to me, he said. Naomi looked down at the silver tray. Fresh coffee, whole grain toast, scrambled eggs with herbs, turkey sausage, fresh strawberries, orange slices, Greek yogurt with honey. He smiled faintly. No. Describe what you see. She frowned slightly. The sunlight is reflecting across the coffee pot. The steam is rising in thin ribbons. The strawberries are brighter than the flowers beside the window. Someone arranged everything perfectly, but the toast is already cooling because they expected me to leave quickly. For the first time since she entered the suite, Kong Teo laughed. It was quiet, genuine, and unexpectedly warm. Outside the executive floor, 3 employees still lingered near the hallway, waiting for raised voices, waiting for embarrassment, waiting for the sound of security arriving. Instead, 10 minutes passed. Then 12. Then 15. No shouting. No argument. No hurried footsteps. Only silence. And behind the closed door, the conversation they had hoped would destroy one quiet black waitress was becoming the first honest conversation either of them had experienced in a very long time. To understand why those 15 quiet minutes mattered so much, you have to understand who Naomi Brooks had been long before she ever carried breakfast into the executive suite. Nothing about her life suggested she would become the one person capable of reaching a man the rest of the world had already decided was unreachable. Naomi was 26 years old, and for nearly 5 years she had worked the morning shift inside the Grand Kensington Hotel, one of Chicago's most prestigious luxury destinations where a single night inside the executive suites cost more than she earned in 2 weeks. Guests remembered the marble floors, the rooftop skyline, and the 5-star service. Almost none of them remembered the people carrying the trays. Naomi never complained about that. She believed dignity did not require an audience. Every morning, she left the small apartment she shared with her 19-year-old sister, Ava, before sunrise. Ava was halfway through nursing school, brilliant, determined, and the reason Naomi accepted every extra shift the restaurant manager offered. Their mother, Denise Brooks, had passed away 3 years earlier after living with diabetes that slowly stole her eyesight before taking the rest of her health. During those final years, Naomi became her mother's eyes. She described autumn leaves blazing outside the kitchen window. She explained every family photograph one smile at a time. She learned never to grab her mother's arm without asking first, because Denise always said losing sight was painful enough without losing independence too. Naomi learned something else during those years. Blindness never made people smaller. Other people's assumptions did. She learned to announce every movement before making it. She learned to describe rooms instead of rushing through them. She learned that respect could be heard in someone's voice long before it could ever be seen. Nobody inside the hotel knew any of that. To her coworkers, Naomi was simply the quiet black waitress who skipped after-work drinks, ignored gossip, and somehow stayed polite even after impossible shifts. In a workplace where rumors traveled faster than elevators, quiet people rarely remained misunderstood for long. Silence became arrogance. Kindness became weakness. Independence became an insult. That was exactly why Melissa Harper disliked her. Melissa had managed the executive dining floor for almost 7 years and ruled it through carefully traded favors, whispered alliances, and carefully assigned opportunities. She decided who served celebrity guests. She decided who earned generous tips. She decided who disappeared into invisible corners carrying ordinary trays. Naomi never competed for those privileges. She simply did her work. Somehow that irritated Melissa even more. There was something threatening about a person who did not ask permission to keep their self-respect. So when the hotel received another extended reservation from Kong Global Holdings, Melissa immediately recognized an opportunity. Every employee had heard stories about Kong Teo, the blind billionaire chief executive officer heir who had chosen to live inside the hotel's executive residence instead of returning to his own family estate overlooking Lake Michigan. Officially, renovations explained his stay. Unofficially, the staff had assembled a different story from overheard conversations and scattered rumors. They believed his own relatives questioned whether a blind man should inherit an international hospitality empire. They whispered that board members doubted his judgment. They whispered he had become impossible to please because disappointment had become the only language people ever spoke around him. Melissa smiled the moment she saw his standing breakfast request appear on the schedule. She did not assign her strongest server. She assigned the quiet woman everyone believed would come back in tears. What she never considered was that sometimes the people chosen to be humiliated are exactly the ones prepared to rewrite someone else's story. The executive dining floor had never felt so restless. By the time Naomi stepped out of the private suite carrying an empty breakfast tray, nearly 25 minutes had passed. She walked with the same quiet pace she always had, shoulders relaxed, eyes forward, giving no sign that anything unusual had happened behind those closed doors. That calm unsettled everyone waiting outside far more than tears ever could have. Melissa looked at her watch before looking back at Naomi. "What happened in there?" she asked, forcing a casual smile that sounded anything but casual. Naomi answered honestly, "I served breakfast. That is all. That is all." Melissa studied her face, searching for embarrassment, anger, anything she could use to continue the story she had already written in her mind. Instead, she found something else. Peace. It lasted only a second before another employee hurried from the concierge desk, holding a digital tablet. "Melissa," he called. "There is an update on Mr. Kang's service preferences." She accepted the tablet without concern. The confidence disappeared almost immediately. Printed across the screen in bold letters was a single instruction entered directly from the executive suite. Effective immediately. Morning executive breakfast service requested exclusively by Naomi Brooks until further notice. No substitutions without guest approval. The hallway fell completely silent. One waitress blinked twice as though she had misread the screen. Another quietly lowered the coffee pitcher she had been carrying. Melissa stared at the message for several long seconds before forcing a tight smile. There must be some mistake. It came directly from Mr. Kang's personal account, the concierge replied. He approved it himself. Naomi looked just as surprised as everyone else. "I did not ask for this." "Apparently he did," the concierge answered. Melissa handed the tablet back a little too quickly. "Fine, if that is what the guest wants." Her voice remained professional, but the muscles along her jaw tightened enough for Naomi to notice. Control had always been Melissa's greatest strength. Losing even a small piece of it felt unfamiliar. Naomi returned to the restaurant floor where the breakfast rush had already begun. Orders filled the kitchen monitors. Espresso machines hissed constantly. Guests discussed stock prices, conference schedules, and afternoon flights without ever noticing the storm quietly forming among the staff. Every few minutes someone glanced toward Naomi before whispering to someone else. She ignored all of it. That afternoon, after finishing a double shift, she returned home carrying discounted pastries the kitchen planned to throw away. Ava was sitting at the tiny dining table, surrounded by nursing textbooks and handwritten notes. "Long day?" her sister asked. Naomi smiled wearily. "Stranger than usual." Ava laughed. "That usually means trouble." Naomi considered telling her everything. The strange conversation. The billionaire chief executive officer Heir, who somehow noticed details no one else could. The breakfast request that had turned the restaurant upside down. Instead, she simply shook her head. It was just work. Later that night, after Ava had gone to bed, Naomi lay awake staring at the cracked ceiling above her small bedroom. She kept replaying one moment over and over. Not the rumors. Not Melissa's expression. Not even the exclusive service request. It was the way Kang Teo had spoken her name. Slowly, carefully, as though it actually belonged to someone worth remembering. She did not understand why that stayed with her more than anything else. By sunrise the next morning, she convinced herself it had simply been an unusual assignment. Nothing more. Yet when she reached the executive elevator carrying another breakfast tray, her heartbeat quietly betrayed what her mind refused to admit. She was no longer wondering what kind of man waited inside that suite. She was wondering why, for the first time in years, someone had looked beyond her uniform without ever seeing her face. Naomi knocked twice before entering, balancing the polished breakfast tray with the same quiet confidence she had carried every morning since she first learned to care for her mother. The suite was peaceful except for the distant hum of traffic nearly 40 stories below. Kang Teo was already standing beside the windows, one hand resting lightly against the cool glass as morning sunlight warmed the room. "You are early," he said before she spoke a single word. Naomi smiled despite herself. Breakfast was ready ahead of schedule. "No," he answered with a faint smile. "You left your apartment 7 minutes earlier than yesterday." She stopped walking. "How could you possibly know that?" "Your footsteps are lighter today," he replied. "Yesterday you hesitated outside my door. Today you walked straight here without stopping." People who leave home earlier usually arrive with less urgency. Naomi shook her head in quiet disbelief. "You notice everything." "Not everything," he said softly. "Only the things most people stop listening for." She placed the tray on the dining table and instinctively began announcing each movement. "Your coffee is on the right side of the table. I am moving the fruit closer to your chair. I am placing fresh orange juice beside your left hand." Teo remained silent for a moment before asking, "Why do you always tell me where everything is?" Naomi paused, surprised by the question. "Because it is your breakfast. Most people simply move things without saying anything." She looked toward the skyline before answering. "When my mother lost her eyesight, people stopped speaking to her directly. They grabbed her arm without asking. They moved furniture without warning. They talked about her instead of to her. She hated that more than losing her vision." The room became remarkably still. "So, I learned to do the opposite," Naomi continued. "I learned that describing a room gives someone independence. Announcing a movement is another way of saying you deserve to know what is happening around you." Teo lowered his head slightly. "No one has explained it that way before. Maybe they never had to. Or maybe they never cared enough." His answer lingered between them far longer than either expected. Naomi quietly poured fresh coffee. Steam drifted upward, carrying the rich aroma through the suite. "The sunrise is beautiful today," she said almost absent-mindedly. "Describe it." She looked outside. The city stretched beneath them in soft shades of gold and blue. Early commuters crossed bridges that looked like ribbons suspended above the river. Glass towers reflected the morning light until the skyline seemed to glow from within. "The clouds look like they forgot whether they belonged to yesterday or today," she said slowly. "The lake is almost perfectly still. There is a red delivery truck crossing Michigan Avenue, and the sunlight keeps flashing across its windshield every few seconds. A little girl wearing a bright yellow backpack is trying to catch up with her father at the crosswalk. She keeps laughing every time she almost reaches him." Teo smiled, not politely, but genuinely. "Nobody has painted mornings for me like that in a very long time." Naomi looked back toward him. His expression had softened in a way the hotel roomers never could have imagined. For the first time, she realized that the silence surrounding him had never been built from arrogance. It had been built from loneliness. Outside the suite, Melissa happened to pass the executive hallway while reviewing staffing schedules. She slowed when she noticed the service timer displayed outside the private residence. 28 minutes. Breakfast service should have ended in 15. She frowned. Every morning the visits grew longer. Every morning Naomi returned looking calmer, while the most intimidating guest in the hotel requested her again. Melissa could not explain it. She only knew one thing with absolute certainty. Whatever was happening inside that suite was slipping further beyond her control with every passing day. The routine settled quietly into something neither of them had expected. Every morning Naomi arrived with breakfast, and every morning the 15 minutes scheduled on the hotel calendar somehow became 30 or 40 before either of them noticed the time. She described the changing skyline, the weather rolling across Lake Michigan, the color of passing delivery trucks, the flowers being replaced in the hotel courtyard, and the expressions of strangers crossing the plaza below. Teo listened with the same focused attention other people reserved for board meetings worth millions of dollars. One Thursday morning, after she finished arranging the breakfast table, he spoke before she could step away. "You did not sleep much." Naomi stopped in the middle of adjusting a linen napkin. "How do you know that?" "Your left foot dragged slightly after you entered the suite," he answered calmly. "You usually breathe evenly while you work. Today your breathing has been shallow since you walked through the door, and you have spoken fewer words than usual." Naomi stared at him in amazement. "You can really hear all of that?" "I can hear the difference between exhaustion and worry." His voice remained gentle. "Today it is worry." She looked down at the polished silver coffee pot, uncertain whether she should answer. For years, she had become skilled at carrying burdens without letting anyone notice. Somehow this man noticed them before she even opened her mouth. "My sister had another difficult night," she admitted quietly. "She has examinations next week. She keeps pretending she is not stressed, but I know her too well." Teo nodded slowly. "You stayed awake encouraging her." Naomi smiled faintly. "How did you know that part?" "Because your voice is tired, but not discouraged." People who stay awake for someone they love sound different from people who stay awake because they are alone. Silence settled between them again, warmer now than awkward. Finally Teo spoke. "When I first lost my sight, everyone kept telling me what I could no longer do. They never asked what I had learned instead." Naomi looked toward him. "What did you learn?" "That people reveal themselves through details they think nobody notices. Confidence has a rhythm. Fear changes breathing. Regret hides inside hesitation. Most people think blindness means missing the world." He smiled quietly. "Most days I think I notice more of it than anyone else." Naomi considered his words carefully before answering. "Maybe that is why you recognized me before you ever knew my face." His expression softened. "No, I recognized honesty." Those two words stayed with her long after they stopped talking. Downstairs, however, the atmosphere continued changing in a very different direction. Melissa had begun watching the executive service schedule almost obsessively. Every morning, Naomi disappeared upstairs. Every morning, she returned carrying an empty tray and a lighter expression than the day before. Other waitresses had started whispering during breaks, inventing stories to explain what none of them actually understood. Some claimed the billionaire chief executive officer Heir was planning to hire Naomi privately. Others insisted she had somehow gained influence inside Kong Global Holdings. Melissa dismissed every rumor aloud, yet secretly, she kept checking the service reports herself. She knew one fact nobody could argue with. Kong Teo had never requested the same employee day after day before Naomi arrived. Control had always depended on predicting people. For the first time in years, Melissa realized she could no longer predict either of them. Late that afternoon, another executive reservation appeared in the system under Teo's profile. Morning breakfast service. Same suite. Same instruction. Naomi Brooks exclusively. As the confirmation notification appeared across the hotel network, Melissa stared at the screen a little longer than necessary. She did not realize it yet, but what had started as a simple attempt to embarrass one quiet black waitress was slowly becoming the one decision she would regret more than any assignment she had ever made. The first sign that something outside the hotel was changing arrived on a quiet Tuesday morning. Naomi found Teo standing beside the window exactly where he always waited, but this time his phone rested on the dining table instead of in his pocket. He had clearly ended a call only moments before she entered. The confidence she had slowly watched return to his voice over the past week had disappeared. Even before he spoke, she noticed his breathing was slower, heavier, measured with the kind of control people use when they're trying not to reveal disappointment. She quietly placed breakfast on the table before asking, "Is everything all right?" He let several seconds pass before answering. "My uncle requested an emergency board meeting." Naomi looked toward him. "Is that unusual?" "Not anymore." His smile carried no warmth. "He wants the board to reconsider whether I am fit to remain the future chief executive officer of Kong Global Holdings." Naomi felt the words settle heavily between them. "Because you are blind?" "He prefers another word." Teo turned slightly toward her. "Condition." He spoke the last word almost as though it belonged to someone else. "He has called it my condition for 15 years. Naomi slowly sat across from him, forgetting entirely that she was supposed to leave once breakfast had been served. "What happens if the board agrees with him?" she asked. "I lose operational authority over the company until another leadership committee decides otherwise." He said it calmly, but she could hear something underneath the calm. Fatigue. Not from fighting. From fighting the same battle for far too long. "Why have you stayed here instead of facing them?" she asked quietly. He gave a soft laugh that carried no humor. "Because every time I walk back into that house, I become the 21-year-old man who left the hospital believing everyone else had already decided what his future would be. It became easier to build a life somewhere nobody constantly reminded me of what I had lost." Naomi looked out across the city before answering. The morning sun reflected across the glass towers just as it had every day before, completely unaware of the conversation unfolding high above the streets below. "That is not living," she said gently. "That is hiding." The room fell completely silent. Teo turned toward her more slowly than usual. "You are the first person who has ever said that to me." Naomi lowered her eyes for a moment. "Maybe everyone else was afraid of hurting you. Were you?" She shook her head. "No. I respected you too much to lie." For several long moments, neither of them spoke. Finally, Teo smiled. Not because the problem had disappeared, but because someone had chosen honesty over comfort. "You know," he said quietly, "most people spend their lives trying to protect me from difficult truths." Naomi returned his smile. "My mother used to tell me that pretending someone is fragile eventually convinces them they are." He nodded slowly. "I think your mother would have been a remarkable woman." She was. The conversation drifted back to ordinary things after that, but something invisible had shifted between them. Trust had quietly replaced caution. Downstairs, however, ordinary conversations had disappeared completely. Melissa noticed Naomi leaving the executive suite nearly 40 minutes after entering once again. She folded her arms as another waitress leaned closer. "Whatever is happening upstairs," the younger server whispered, "it is making everyone talk." Melissa watched Naomi walk calmly across the lobby without noticing the eyes following her. "Then perhaps," Melissa answered coldly. "It is time someone reminded her that people who attract attention inside this hotel rarely enjoy how the story ends." The rumors reached Naomi before breakfast the next morning, carried not by strangers, but by the one person whose opinion mattered most. Ava was waiting in the kitchen with 2 mugs of coffee and an expression that immediately told Naomi something was wrong. "One of my classmates works weekends at the hotel," Ava said carefully. "She asked me if you were really dating some billionaire chief executive officer." Naomi nearly laughed until she realized her sister was completely serious. "What?" Ava hesitated. "They are saying you have been spending nearly an hour every morning inside his suite. They are saying he requested you because he likes you. Someone even claimed you were trying to leave the restaurant by getting close to him." Naomi felt something cold settle quietly in her chest. She had expected whispers eventually. She had simply hoped they would not reach home. "None of that is true," she answered firmly. "I know," Ava said without hesitation. "But rumors do not need truth. They only need people willing to repeat them." The word stayed with Naomi throughout her commute. By the time she stepped into the executive elevator carrying another breakfast tray, the confidence she had built over the past week felt unexpectedly fragile. She knocked softly before entering. Teo noticed the difference almost immediately. "You have been crying." Naomi instinctively shook her head before remembering he could not see the gesture. "No." He smiled faintly. That was not an answer. She set the tray down without speaking. "Your breathing is uneven," he continued. "You stopped outside my door longer than usual. And your footsteps were lighter, which you only do when you are trying not to be noticed. Something happened." Naomi remained silent for another few seconds before finally giving up the battle she had already lost. People are talking. His expression grew still. About us. She nodded before realizing she needed words. Yes. Tell me. She explained everything. The whispers in the restaurant. The conversations spreading through the hotel. The stories reaching nursing students who had never even met her. Every sentence seemed to make the room quieter. When she finally finished, Teo did not answer immediately. He simply stood beside the window with one hand resting lightly against the chair, his jaw tightening almost imperceptibly. Melissa started them, he said at last. Naomi frowned. You cannot know that. Actually, I can. His voice remained calm, but there was unmistakable certainty behind it. Every morning, she waits exactly 23 feet outside this suite before your shift begins. She wears heels with a damaged left heel cap that clicks slightly louder than the right. Yesterday, she stopped outside my door for almost 40 seconds after you left. She breathed through her mouth instead of her nose. Naomi stared at him. You can tell all of that. People who gossip always linger longer than people with work to do. He turned toward her. Did she ever apologize for sending you here that first morning? Naomi looked down. No, because she never expected this conversation to happen. His words carried no anger, only disappointment. She expected humiliation. Instead, she created honesty. Naomi sighed softly. I wish people would stop assuming every kind interaction has to become something else. Teo smiled gently. People often misunderstand what they have never experienced themselves. He walked slowly toward the table before adding, there is one more thing you should know. What? The board meeting was moved forward. Her heartbeat quickened. When? 10 days from now. Silence settled over the suite once again. Outside the windows, Chicago continued moving exactly as it always had. Cars crossed intersections. Boats drifted across the river. Office workers hurried toward meetings that suddenly felt very small compared to the quiet decision waiting for one blind billionaire chief executive officer Heir. For the first time since they met, Naomi realized the greatest challenge facing Teo had never been losing his sight. It was convincing the people closest to him that he had never lost his ability to lead. 10 days passed more quickly than either of them expected. On the morning of the board meeting, Chicago woke beneath a clear blue sky that stretched endlessly above the glass towers of downtown. Naomi stood quietly near the back of the Kong Global Holdings boardroom, wearing the same simple black uniform she had worn on the day their paths first crossed. She did not belong among polished executives, expensive suits, or billion-dollar decisions, yet somehow she felt exactly where she was supposed to be. Across the room, Kong Teo stood at the head of the long conference table while members of the board settled into silence. His uncle began the presentation with polished confidence, speaking about responsibility, stability, and the future of the company. Then, almost casually, he repeated the same word that had followed Teo for 15 years. Condition. The room remained quiet. Teo waited until every sentence had been spoken before calmly rising to his feet. Before anyone votes, he said evenly, I would like to point out something interesting. My uncle has cleared his throat 5 times during the last 7 minutes. He only does that when he believes someone may uncover something he hoped would remain hidden. He did the same thing years ago during my father's estate hearing. A ripple of surprise moved around the room. His uncle opened his mouth to respond, but Teo continued without raising his voice. Everyone here already knows I cannot see with my eyes. What some of you still refuse to understand is that I have spent 15 years learning to hear what other people overlook. Leadership has never depended on eyesight. It depends on judgment, honesty, and the courage to face uncomfortable truths. I hear fear in this room today, but it is not mine. Silence settled over the boardroom with a weight no presentation could overcome. One by one, board members exchanged thoughtful glances before the vote was finally called. When the results appeared on the screen, the outcome was unmistakable. Teo had retained full authority as future chief executive officer of Kong Global Holdings by an overwhelming majority. His uncle quietly gathered his documents without another argument. As the room slowly emptied, Teo walked toward Naomi with a lighter step than she had ever heard before. I could not have done that 2 weeks ago, he admitted softly. Naomi smiled. Yes, you could have. He tilted his head slightly. Then why did I not? She looked through the floor-to-ceiling windows where afternoon sunlight reflected across the city they had described together so many mornings before. Because you finally stopped trying to prove everyone else wrong and started believing you were already enough. For a long moment, he said nothing. Then he reached into his jacket and handed her a simple envelope. "Before you misunderstand," he said with a faint smile, "this is not money." Naomi opened it carefully. Inside was information about a full scholarship through the Kong Foundation that would cover the remainder of Ava's nursing education based entirely on academic merit. "She earned this herself," Teo said. "I only made certain someone finally noticed." Naomi looked up, unable to speak for several seconds. "Thank you." He gently shook his head. "Do not thank me for recognizing what was already there." Several weeks later, Melissa quietly left the Grand Kensington Hotel after an internal investigation confirmed a pattern of workplace intimidation that reached far beyond Naomi alone. The decision came from hotel leadership after employees finally found the courage to tell the truth. Naomi never celebrated the outcome. Justice had never meant watching someone else fall. It meant making certain fewer people would suffer the same way again. Life gradually settled into a quieter rhythm. Ava began nursing school with renewed confidence. Teo led Kong Global Holdings with the same careful wisdom that others had mistaken for weakness. And every so often, after another long morning meeting, he still invited Naomi to share breakfast, not because she was the black waitress who had once carried a silver tray into his suite, but because she was the first person who had reminded him that real vision had never belonged to the eyes. It belonged to the heart willing to see the worth in another human being before the rest of the world ever noticed.